In the silent dawn of an ancient desert, the story of a forgotten son begins to breathe again. His name was Ishmael, the firstborn of Abraham, a name that once echoed between tents and sands, destined to shape nations. His birth was not wrapped in celebration, but in conflict, born from the tension between faith and human impatience. While God's promise still lingered in the distance, Sarah, Abraham's wife, offered her Egyptian servant Hagar to bear a child. In that moment of human doubt, destiny shifted forever. Hagar's womb became the cradle of a child who would one day be called a wild man, untamed and strong, his hands against all and all against him. Yet in his small cry, God already heard the beginning of a lineage that would run deep through history. Ishmael's arrival was both a gift and a wound. Abraham's joy collided with Sarah's growing unrest. The tents of their home, once filled with quiet hope, now carried whispers of jealousy and fear. As the boy grew, Abraham's love for him only deepened. He saw in Ishmael his legacy, the continuation of his blood, the answer he thought heaven had finally delivered. But God's silence was not approval. It was preparation. When Isaac, the true child of the divine promise, was finally born to Sarah, the fragile balance shattered. What had once been tolerated turned unbearable. Ishmael's laughter, once innocent, became a spark of bitterness in Sarah's heart. Each time Sarah looked upon the young Ishmael, her peace vanished. Every sound of his laughter near Isaac felt like a reminder of her own mistake, of a decision made from desperation, not faith. The jealousy that once whispered now screamed within her. One day, as the two boys played, her anger erupted like a storm that could no longer be contained. "He will not share the inheritance with my son," she demanded. "He must leave." Abraham's heart broke under the weight of her words. How could a father cast away his own blood? His nights became long, filled with tears and unanswered prayers. Yet God spoke to him in that tormenting silence, saying that Ishmael too would become a great nation, for he was Abraham's seed. And so, with trembling hands and a heart heavy as stone, Abraham packed bread and water for Hagar and the boy. Love and obedience collided at that crossroads, and the father of faith let go. The sun burned mercilessly as Hagar and Ishmael wandered into the wilderness of Beersheba. The horizon stretched endlessly, a sea of sand swallowing hope. Their water soon ran dry, and despair crept in like a shadow. Hagar's strength withered. She could no longer bear the sight of her child dying. She laid Ishmael beneath a shrub, stepped away, and wept until her tears turned to dust. The desert became a mirror of her soul, empty, silent, and waiting for a miracle. Then came a voice, soft yet commanding, piercing through her despair. "Do not be afraid." It was the voice of an angel, gentle like the wind, but powerful enough to still her trembling heart. "God has heard the boy's cry," the angel said. "Lift him up, for I will make of him a great nation." The divine promise, once forgotten, now shimmered again in the heat of the desert air. When Hagar opened her eyes, she saw what had been invisible, a well of water, glistening like a secret gift from heaven. She ran to it, filled her skin with water, and revived the boy's lips with life. In that sacred moment, death fled, and destiny reawakened. The desert, once their enemy, had become their witness. Ishmael drank, rose, and walked into a future shaped by divine mercy. The years passed, and the boy grew into a man molded by fire and wind. The wilderness became his teacher, his forge. Each sunrise tested him, and each night strengthened him. He learned to draw the bow with precision, his arrows singing through the air like prayers of survival. The same desert that had almost consumed him now bent before him. Where others saw death, he saw discipline. Where others saw emptiness, he saw the hand of God. Ishmael became more than a survivor. He became the embodiment of resilience. His scars were not marks of defeat, but symbols of divine endurance. He had learned that those who walk alone with God are never truly lost. In the silence of the dunes, he found not abandonment but purpose, and the same voice that once spoke to his mother began to echo in his heart. "You are not forgotten." From that moment, Ishmael no longer lived in the shadow of Isaac, or under the memory of rejection. He walked with a quiet strength, the kind that only those who have wrestled with despair can carry. His destiny was no longer about surviving the desert, it was about transforming it. The boy once left to die had become the man chosen to lead. And in that vast expanse of sand and stars, Ishmael lifted his eyes to the heavens and whispered the name of the God who saw him, the God who turns exile into inheritance, the God who never forgets his promises. The desert, once the place of exile, became the kingdom of Ishmael. Every grain of sand seemed to whisper his name. Every gust of wind carried the echo of God's promise. He no longer wandered aimlessly. He moved with purpose, guided by the unseen hand that had once called out to his mother. The wilderness was no longer punishment. It was preparation. In its silence, Ishmael learned to hear God's voice clearer than he ever could among men. He built his life between the stones and the stars, a nomad of destiny. The bough became his companion, the hunt his ritual, and endurance his creed. He understood that strength was not found in comfort, but in struggle. The desert taught him that abundance begins where self-pity ends. He who once begged for water now led others to hidden wells. Ishmael was no longer the child of rejection. He was becoming the father of nations. Years rolled over the sands like endless waves. Ishmael's camp grew with new faces, warriors, wanderers, and dreamers drawn to his courage. He taught them to read the desert like a sacred book, to find paths where others saw only chaos. He was not merely their leader, he was their teacher, their example of faith forged through fire. Under his watch, the barren lands began to bloom with life, hope, and the beginnings of legacy. It was then that the voice returned, not as thunder from the heavens, but as a quiet certainty in his heart. The same voice that had once promised his mother now spoke again to him. "I will make you the father of 12 princes, and I will make you into a great nation." Ishmael bowed his head beneath the vast sky, realizing that his story was never about survival alone. It was about the fulfillment of a divine covenant spoken long before he could understand it. He married a woman from Egypt, and from their union came sons, 12 in number, each strong, fierce, and destined to lead. They bore names that carried the rhythm of eternity: Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedema. Each one was a reflection of their father's resilience, each one destined to found a tribe that would mark the sands of history. Through them, Ishmael's promise began to unfold. These 12 princes became rulers of their own territories, spread across the vast regions of the Middle East. From the edges of Egypt to the plains near Assyria, their influence grew. They were known for their strength, their trade, and their unbreakable bond with the desert. Their tents dotted the horizon like stars fallen upon the earth, and wherever they settled, stories of their origin followed. Tales of a boy who once cried out in the wilderness and was heard by God. The tribes of Ishmael became masters of the trade routes, connecting kingdoms and empires through caravans of gold, spices, and myrrh. Their camels carried not only goods, but knowledge, stories, songs, and wisdom gathered from lands far and near. They became the lifeblood of the desert, the invisible bridge between worlds. And though many feared them for their power, others revered them as guardians of the ancient paths. But power always draws envy. The descendants of Ishmael soon found themselves watched by their distant relatives, the children of Isaac, the heirs of the Promised Land. Though their bloodlines shared a common patriarch, their destinies moved in opposite directions. One was rooted in covenant, the other flowed through freedom. Yet neither could deny the silent thread that still bound them together, the faith of Abraham. One day, as the caravans of Ishmael passed through Canaan, an unexpected story intertwined their paths again. Among their merchants, they encountered a group of men selling a young slave, a boy named Joseph, betrayed by his own brothers, sons of Jacob, Isaac's heir. The irony was divine. The sons of Ishmael, once cast away from Abraham's tent, now became the instruments of destiny for the sons who had remained. Without knowing, they carried Joseph to Egypt, where his journey would reshape nations. The encounter was no coincidence, it was providence. Through that single act of trade, God wove the threads of his promise tighter, showing that rejection does not cancel destiny, it redirects it. The descendants of Ishmael unknowingly fulfilled part of God's greater design, becoming the messengers who transported salvation into foreign lands. It was a moment where exile and promise met again, where bloodlines once divided crossed under the watchful eyes of heaven. As Ishmael aged, he often gazed upon his sons with quiet pride. They were fierce, intelligent, and faithful to their roots. He knew that his name would live through them, echoing in every shifting dune and in every tribe that rose from his lineage. Yet more than power or legacy, Ishmael cherished the one truth he had learned in the desert, that God's faithfulness endures even when human hearts falter. What begins in tears can end in triumph when heaven writes the story. And so the son once forgotten by man became unforgettable to history. His blood flowed through kings, his name through generations, his spirit through the wind. The desert that once sought to silence him now sang his memory across eternity. Ishmael, the survivor, had become Ishmael, the founder. The child of exile had become the father of nations, living proof that God's promises never die, even when spoken in the wilderness. The years passed like whispers of the wind, carrying Ishmael's name beyond the dunes and valleys. His people grew in number and influence, weaving a network of tribes across the ancient deserts. The sons of Ishmael, strong and untamed, learned to command the sands as if they were extensions of their own souls. They tamed the wilderness not by conquering it, but by understanding its rhythm, living in harmony with its silence, its storms, and its stars. In every generation that followed, the memory of that first promise lingered. Elders spoke by the firelight of the boy who once cried in the wilderness and was heard by God himself. They told their children that no matter how far they roamed, the voice that called to their ancestor still echoed in their blood. To the tribes of Ishmael, survival was not merely existence, it was sacred purpose. Every sunrise over the dunes was a reminder that they were living proof of divine mercy. The sons of Ishmael became known as the lords of the desert. They mastered the art of movement, knowing when to advance, when to rest, when to disappear into the shifting sands. Their caravans stretched across continents, carrying incense from Sheba, gold from Ophir, and silk from distant kingdoms. They were the invisible arteries of the ancient world, connecting civilizations through trade, culture, and faith. Yet through all their travels, they never forgot where their story began, with a mother's tears and a God who sees. Their tents stood tall beneath the endless sky, decorated with patterns that told their story. Every thread was a testament to endurance, every color a reflection of fire and faith. And songs of Ishmael were sung during the cool nights, blending the sound of flutes with the rhythm of camel bells. The desert was alive with their legacy, a living scroll written by wind and time. To strangers, they seemed nomads. To themselves, they were chosen wanderers, guided not by maps but by promise. Yet even among them, there were questions whispered on lonely nights. If we too come from Abraham, are we forgotten by his God? Some asked. If Isaac was chosen for the covenant, what of us? The elders would answer softly, we were not forgotten, we were formed differently. The covenant of Isaac was written in stone, but ours was written in the sand. Both are seen by the same God, carried by the same wind." And in those words, faith found its quiet peace. Generations later, those who descended from Ishmael began to sense that their purpose stretched beyond what they could see. They were not only merchants or warriors, they were witnesses of divine endurance. Even their enemies respected them, calling them sons of the desert and people of the wind. They were hard to conquer, for their spirit could not be contained. They had learned from their forefather that rejection does not destroy identity, it reveals it. As empires rose and fell around them, the children of Ishmael endured. They watched kingdoms crumble while their tents still stood firm against the storm. The desert, cruel to the weak, bowed to those who carried Ishmael's blood. They were neither bound by borders nor broken by time. The world called them wanderers, but heaven called them keepers of the promise, the unseen guardians of an ancient prophecy still unfolding beneath the sun. One night, as the elders gathered beneath a moonlit sky, a wise man spoke. "Our ancestor did not die forgotten. His breath still moves with the wind. His story still burns in the stars. When you look above, remember, every constellation was once his ceiling." The young men listened in silence, realizing that they were not merely heirs to a name, but to a purpose that transcended generations. They were part of a divine equation written before time began. And so, the people of Ishmael continued to shape the world in ways unseen. Their hands built trade routes that connected faraway lands. Their tongues carried the echoes of lost languages. Their hearts bore the humility of those who have walked with God through hardship. In their quiet strength lay a wisdom few could understand, the wisdom of those who know that divine promises are not always delivered in comfort, but in endurance. Over the centuries, many tried to erase their legacy. Kings and conquerors dismissed them as wanderers without a land. Yet, like the desert winds, they always returned. Every time history tried to silence their name, the sands whispered it louder. The prophecy given to Abraham had never been limited to one son. It had multiplied, reaching through both Isaac and Ishmael, intertwining their destinies like rivers that flowed in different directions, yet met in the same sea. The descendants of Ishmael did not build temples of stone. They built temples of memory. Their faith was not bound to walls, but to the horizon. When they prayed with their faces to the sky, trusting the same God who had heard a crying child in the wilderness. Their devotion was not born of ritual, but of remembrance. They lived not to be seen, but to remind the world that even in desolation, God fulfills His word. And through the shifting sands of time, the legacy of Ishmael became more than a story of survival. It became a mirror, showing every soul that has ever felt forgotten that they are still seen, still chosen, still held by divine hands. The desert was not a curse, it was a classroom, and the lesson was eternal. God never abandons those He has named. As generations unfolded, the sons of Ishmael continued to move with the rhythm of the earth, travelers of both sand and soul. They crossed lands that no one else dared to, guided by stars that seemed to recognize their lineage. Every step they took across the desert felt like a heartbeat of their ancestor, a pulse that still carried the promise spoken by God. Their story was not written on parchment, but in footsteps, carved into the shifting dunes of eternity. The tribes of Ishmael grew numerous and wise. Some settled near oases, building markets where strangers from distant lands could find rest, trade, and stories. Others remained in motion, their tents rising and falling with the wind, like waves in a sea of gold. Together they formed a web of life across the deserts of Arabia, free, fearless, and bound by their shared ancestry. They were men and women of vision, their eyes always searching the horizon for divine signs. Their culture became a melody of languages, colors, and songs, a bridge between East and West. Merchants, poets, and warriors moved side by side, carrying perfumes, spices, and tales that spoke of heaven and endurance. Their caravans brought not only material wealth, but spiritual insight, spreading echoes of Abraham's faith wherever they went. The children of Ishmael became the unseen messengers of a divine legacy, traveling farther than they could ever imagine. Still, the shadows of division followed them. Between the descendants of Isaac and those of Ishmael, invisible lines of tension ran deep. Both peoples carried the mark of divine favor, yet they lived under different covenants, one bound by the law, the other by freedom. There were times of peace, moments when they fought side by side, united by shared blood and the memory of the same patriarch. But there were also times when jealousy and misunderstanding kindled wars across the sands. Through every battle and truce, the desert remained the silent witness. It had seen brothers divided, yet it also held the memory of reconciliation. For even in conflict, the two lineages carried the same spark of promise, that through Abraham all nations would be blessed. Ishmael's children did not know how, but deep within they sensed that their existence served a higher purpose, one that even the harsh winds could not erase. They were part of something eternal. In the evenings, as the sun disappeared behind the dunes, storytellers spoke of their origin, not with bitterness, but with awe. They reminded the young that being born of struggle was not a curse, but a calling. "The God of our father does not forget," they would say. "He who heard the child in the desert still listens to us." These words became their inheritance, more precious than gold, more lasting than empire. Faith was their fortress, the sky, their temple. Over the centuries, the sons of Ishmael became masters of endurance. They could cross deserts without maps, survive storms without fear, and find life where others saw only emptiness. Their strength was not in numbers, but in spirit, a resilience born from divine encounter. The world admired their skill, but rarely understood their depth. To outsiders, they were nomads. To themselves, they were keepers of a promise older than any kingdom. Some say that in Ishmael's final days, when his hair had turned white like desert salt, he returned to the place where his journey began. He stood beneath the same sky that had once watched his tears and whispered, "The Lord who saw me has never turned his face away." The winds seemed to bow in reverence, as if the desert itself remembered. Ishmael lifted his staff toward the horizon, his eyes filled with gratitude, not regret. He had lived to see the promise alive in his sons. When he died, his children gathered around his tent. They buried him in the field of Mamre, near his father Abraham, and their tears watered the ground that had once witnessed his cries as a child. Two lines of destiny lay side by side. Isaac and Ishmael, the promised and the cast out, united in death as they had once been in life. The earth, for that brief moment, held reconciliation in its dust. The story that began in division ended in embrace. And though his body returned to the sand, Ishmael's spirit remained in every desert wind that sweeps across the ancient world. His name became a whisper of endurance, a symbol for those who have been forgotten, a testament that faith can thrive even in exile. His legacy stretched beyond geography or blood. It became a map for the human soul, a reminder that divine love reaches even those who walk farthest from home. As centuries passed, prophets and travelers spoke of Ishmael's descendants. They would give rise to nations, empires, and faiths that shaped the destiny of the earth. Yet at the core of it all remained one truth, that God had never abandoned the child of the wilderness. What began as a story of separation became a symphony of connection, proving that even what man casts out, God can crown with purpose. The desert that once tried to swallow him had become his throne. And so Ishmael's story was never about rejection. It was about redemption. The tears of his mother, the anguish of his father, and the silence of the desert all led to a revelation that still resonates through time. God sees, God remembers, and God fulfills every word he speaks, even when the world has forgotten. Centuries turned into millennia, and yet the breath of Ishmael's legacy continued to move like wind across the earth. From his sons came nations, and from those nations came empires, whose names were carved into the heart of history. The tents of the desert had multiplied into cities, and the languages once whispered by the fire had become the tongues of kingdoms. But beneath all the changes, one truth remained unshaken. The blood of Ishmael still carried the sound of promise. Even when the world forgot his name, heaven never did. The God who had once heard the cry of a dying boy still watched over the generations that followed. In every man who rose from hardship, in every woman who endured the storm with faith, there was a reflection of Hagar and her son. Their story had transcended lineage. It had become a message. It told all of humanity that divine mercy is not limited by walls, temples, or nations. It flows wherever hearts are open. Through the ages, the descendants of Ishmael became known not only for their strength, but for their faith. The deserts they inhabited became the crossroads of revelation, where prophets would one day walk and speak the words of God. From the wilderness that once held despair emerged voices that would call nations to prayer. What began as exile became the cradle of spiritual awakening. The wilderness of Ishmael became the womb of prophecy. There among the endless sands men learned to bow, not to the wind or to kings, but to the one who created both. They remembered the story of their forefather, the one who survived abandonment and became the father of nations. They carried that resilience into their prayers, their work, their families. The desert still taught its lessons: silence, humility, endurance, and in that silence they still heard the same whisper that once reached a mother's heart. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. The promise made to Abraham through Ishmael and Isaac was never about division, it was about destiny. Two brothers, two paths, one God. Both carried parts of the same flame, one illuminating the covenant of lineage, the other the covenant of faith. Though history often remembered their differences, heaven never did. To God, both sons remained beloved, each fulfilling a divine role in the great story of redemption that would one day touch every corner of the earth. And so, the story of Ishmael became a mirror for every soul who has ever felt cast aside. It tells the weary that they are still seen. It tells the rejected that their name is still written in the heart of God. When life feels like a desert, dry, silent, endless, the story of Ishmael whispers that even there, water can spring from the impossible. The God who opened a well for a desperate mother still opens doors where hope seems buried. There is a moment in every life when faith must walk alone, when the noise of the world fades and only the sound of one's heartbeat remains. In that solitude, Ishmael's journey speaks louder than words. He reminds us that faith is not built in comfort, but in silence, not in abundance, but in need. The desert, though harsh, is sacred because it strips away everything until only God remains. And in that emptiness, we find the fullness of his promise. Even now, the winds that sweep across Arabia carry his story. They whisper of a boy who should have died but lived to shape destiny. They tell of a mother who wept and prayed and found God in her pain. They remind us that divine promises are not bound to human timelines. They bloom in their appointed time. Ishmael's tears became rivers. His exile became inheritance. His silence became song. And perhaps that is why his story endures, because it belongs not only to one man or one people, but to every heart that has ever felt unseen. Ishmael's life is a testimony that God's love reaches beyond human favor, beyond failure, beyond fear. The God who saw him in the desert sees you now, in your own wilderness. And just as he did for Ishmael, he is preparing a well for you, a place of renewal, of peace, of divine purpose. When you feel forgotten, remember the God who never forgets. When you feel lost, remember the God who found a child in the sand. When your soul thirsts for meaning, remember the well that never runs dry. The desert is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of your becoming. Ishmael walked through it and found his name written in eternity. You too are seen, known, and destined for more. And as the stars rise once more above the ancient sands, the same promise still echoes. I will make you great, and I will never leave you. The story of Ishmael is the story of every believer who has walked through abandonment and found divine embrace. The desert will always test you, but it will also reveal you. For in the wilderness, God does not simply save, He transforms. So tonight, as you reflect on His story, let faith rise within you. Remember that even the forgotten are part of God's grand design. The same voice that called to Hagar and Ishmael calls to you now, whispering hope, strength, and purpose. If you believe that no desert is too empty for God's presence, write Amen in the comments. And let your faith become a testimony that, like Ishmael, you too are seen by the one who never forgets.